Meanwhile, the policy of the occupiers against the Vichy regime accelerated its collapse. Events in North Africa clearly showed the Germans that Marshal Pétain and his government is not able to prevent the French from turning against them at the first opportunity. Seeing that the great test, the landing of the Allies, was approaching, fearing what might then produce in their rear the national uprising that had broken out, needing French resources for their own economy, which had been shaken by the war, the occupiers now attached extremely little importance to the so-called French state and tightened the grip of oppression. And then the fiction of internal autonomy to which the Vichy government had clung finally dissipated. At any rate, Pétain, who had transferred virtually all power to Laval, could no longer pompously play the role of defender of the French, which he had previously so boasted. He was now shy and refused to interfere in the affairs of the government. Indeed, it was already engaged only in the use of coercive or repressive measures. In November, Pétain found that he was literally forbidden to speak on the radio. In December, Laval, returning from a visit to the Führer, made changes in the cabinet in order to cooperate more fully with the invaders in his ministry. He introduced Brinnenei Darnand, and then Dare, and the Marshal did not think to oppose it. The man who still called himself head of state tolerated the presence of a German overseer attached to him in the person of Rent Fink. Pétain went so far that on December 18th, himself wrote to Hitler changes in French laws will henceforth be coordinated with the German occupation authorities. If later he still managed to appear publicly in Paris, in Rouen, in Nancy, in Saint Etienne, where people expressed pity and sympathy for him, but seeing in him only a hapless old man, he did not utter a single word there, which would be heard sobbing over the ashes of the suffocated independence of France. Let the laughable Vichy power still try to surround itself with some decorum, let vain or unscrupulous men like Philippe Henriot and Harold Paquis exhaust their vicious talent in their zeal to deceive the masses, and let the newspapers spew insults against those who had fought. The whole people now hated the Vichy regime and wanted it to collapse as soon as the Germans had fled. In France, of course, the broad masses had no doubt what kind of government would then be established in Paris, and prepared to welcome it warmly. But those politicians who had put in power Pétain, and now feared that with his fall will come to an end and their careers, did not want to reconcile with this prospect. Since the end of 1943, all sorts of intrigues have been going on, aimed at achieving such a position, so that at the decisive moment to somehow limit the power of General de Gaulle, and if possible, then completely remove him. The Marshal secretly ordered that if he was unable to exercise his duties, they should be entrusted to a college of prominent political figures who had different views of the events. The first constitutional act by which this neutral directory was established was placed in safe hands. A little while later, the Marshal, in another constitutional act, which clearly contradicted the first and was intended for publication, specified that if he died before the proclamation of the Constitution, which he had allegedly prepared, the powers he had received from the National Assembly of 1940 would revert to this very assembly. It is true that the Germans resisted the dissemination of this testament of Pétain, although for the general public it was in fact of no interest. Those parliamentarians who had not joined me, either in deed or in spirit, did not stop fussing at this time. They shook their parliamentary mandates as if they had never changed them. They claimed that the National Assembly, dissolved in July 1940, was still legitimate, although it had in fact abdicated its powers. They demanded that this assembly be convened, if only to settle the question of government. Anatole de Monzy, the initiator of this petition, collected the signatures of several hundred of his colleagues on it, and, when the Marshal's condition deteriorated, demanded that he submit to their design. But Hitler, irritated by this fuss, ordered Ribbentrop to write a letter to Pétain, in which he once and for all forbade him to reckon with the dissolved in his time parliament, for only the German Wehrmacht ensures public order in France. The impatient parliamentarians fell silent, but later put forward their project again. For their part, the Allies could no longer count on Giraud to be a counterweight to de Gaulle, and looked for some new candidate. From France, I was warned that, in the opinion of the Allies, a suitable figure was President Lebrun. After the decision of the Vichy Assembly, which deprived Lebrun of his powers, to which, incidentally, he did not protest, he retired to Visil. Could not somehow persons in Washington and London who wished to play with the political destinies of France ask themselves, could not President Lebrun be transported to North Africa? As he has not formally tendered his resignation, and as his position with regard to the enemy leaves nothing to be desired, could he not, on arriving in Algeria, declare that he had fully retained his legal rights? Immediately he would be recognized as President of the French Republic, and not only by the Allied powers, but also by the majority of French citizens, and would de Gaulle and his associates dare to challenge him? And being recognized as President, Lebrun will have the right to appoint ministers, sign laws and decrees. What a consolation after all the trouble which General de Gaulle, with all the intransigence of his primacy, has caused the White House and Downing Street. I am told that in the last days of August the American and British conspirators decided that a favourable opportunity was coming for them. Just at this time Badoglio, in desperate straits, established secret communication with the Anglo-Saxons, desiring to begin negotiations for the surrender of Italy. The negotiations were conducted at Lisbon in the deepest secrecy. The victors had there a full opportunity to officially give the defeated this or that order, and those could fulfill these orders. But Visil, where Lebrun settled, was in the Italian zone of occupation. One evening the president was visited by Italian officers who had arrived from Rome. Referring to the fact that in the course of military operations the Visil area would soon be in a threatened situation and that Albert Lebrun himself was in danger, they, on behalf of their government, offered the ex-president to transport him to Italy, where security and a decent residence awaited him. He was given all the necessary guarantees and a reliable escort. It is known that at the very time when this meeting took place, the Allied command, in agreement with Badoglio, was preparing an operation which, when an armistice was declared with Italy, was to bring the Anglo-Saxons to Naples and, if possible, to Rome, and, in any case, to gather in one place or another King Victor Emmanuel, his ministers and other prominent dignitaries. According to the designs of the persons who held in their hands all the threads of the conspiracy, as soon as Lebrun was in Italy, he could be transported to any place they desired. But, I am told, the president flatly refused the offers made to him. It is possible that he did not guess the true purpose, or more likely that he did, but was unwilling to facilitate such plans. He replied to the Italians, "Your country is at war with my country. To me you are enemies. You may take me away by force, but of my own free will I will not follow you." The envoys retreated, and a little while later Hitler, worried and extremely annoyed by the French stories, ordered the Gestapo to arrest President Lebrun. He was taken to Germany and had to stay there for a year. I must say that these combinations invented in order to avoid the inevitable gave me the impression of some game of Chinese shadows. After all, these intrigues were woven amidst the terrible reality of the war years. I marvelled at the vitality of intrigue. It didn't bother me much. I thought much more about the fate of the resistance in France. Just at that time, the leaders of the movement had died, and then its structure and its orientation were shaken. On the 9th of June, a few days after my arrival in Algeria, General de Lestrade was arrested in Paris. The commander of the secret army was out of action. This could have disorganized the paramilitary groups, and just at the moment when de Lestrade had already begun to unite them. Jean Moulins therefore considered it his duty to convene the representatives of the various groups in order to settle the pressing issues with them. The delegates were called for June 21st. But on that very day Jean Moulin, and all those around him, fell into the clutches of the Gestapo, who raided the meeting and were strangely aware of the time and place of the meeting and the persons who could be captured there. A few weeks later, Moulin died under torture. Jean Moulin's death had grave consequences. He was the epitome of the cause he served. Such men are irreplaceable. The mere fact that he was no longer alive caused profound disruption in the work of a number of services, communications, transportation, information, and others that he personally managed. And it was these services that ensured the integrity of the movement. But most importantly, the death of its head was to have political repercussions and create considerable difficulties for the resistance. It cannot be said that this event affected the mood of the fighters. For the most part, they did not know which organizations were engaged in the preparation of their actions in general, and the names of the people who belonged to these organizations were mostly unknown to them. Morally, the participants of the struggle associated themselves with de Gaulle, and practically, in the conditions of life in the Maquis, the implementation of sabotage, weapons transfer of information, and in general, all the performances took place on a small scale, and the fighters were subordinated in these operations only to the chiefs of their detachments. But with regard to the plans of action of the local liberation committees, propaganda and slogans, the case was more complicated. In the midst of the battle, the political elements had agreed to divert their ambition, but they were not going to give it up altogether. The end of the ordeal was near, and they foresaw an opportunity to rise to power. Moulin, my representative, who directly leaned on me, could, by his high personal qualities, unite and restrain the politicians. With his death, some of them showed a disposition to pursue their own line. This, above all, was noticeable in the communists. They sought to achieve de facto predominance, and, moreover, to give it the character of a supreme body, theoretically linked to my government, but entitled to act independently, at its own risk. It would then be possible for them to use the Council for their own purposes and to carry out such actions under its banner, to place such men in local bodies, to formulate such a program, and perhaps to establish such authorities that in the storm of liberation they could be masters of the situation. If I could immediately appoint a successor to Jean Moulin, and if by his personal qualities my new commissioner could, like Moulin, command the respect of all the representative bodies of the resistance, he would be both head of my delegation and president of the National Council. The dual power that some had tried to create would have been eliminated. But circumstances prevented me from finding such a person immediately. It cannot be said that there were not worthy and courageous men at the head of the various organizations of the resistance. But each of them belonged to one or another political grouping, so strong was their desire for isolation, both in the leaders and in the rank and file. Besides, the day was approaching when France was to rise from the abyss of oppression, and then the life of the country, the social order, the judgment of the world about France would depend to a great extent on the composition of the French administration. It was necessary for me to appoint as my representative in the country, and as head of our services, a man who could everywhere prepare either the preservation of the old administration in the field or its replacement. In short, what was needed was a big official, so to speak, who would take part in our struggle, who would know well its exciting vicissitudes and complex situation, but who would not personally belong to any of the political directions, and who, moreover, would be able, at the right moment, to occupy in the administration of the state the post to which the government would need to place him in the near future. Months passed before I was able to select and send a man who met these manifold requirements. Acting temporarily as my delegates were Claude Bouchenet-Cerily and Jacques Benjean, whom I had at one time sent from London to work with Jean Moulin. The first operated in Paris and managed to maintain all his connections, even though during this period there were terrible devastations in the leadership of the various groups of the movement. The second worked in the southern zone and concentrated his efforts mainly on organizing aid to people fleeing the hijackings to Germany and southwestern France. In the Massif Central and in the Alps the numbers were increasing. Jacques Benjean was captured by the enemy and committed suicide. In September I appointed Émile Bollaert as General de Gaulle's representative and delegate from the National Liberation Committee. Prefect Bollaert was a true patriot in 1940. He refused to swear allegiance to Marshal Pétain and resigned. In his feelings and abilities he was well worthy of the post I offered him. But soon after his appointment Bollaert was arrested by the Germans in Brittany, on the seashore, when he was about to board a ship bound for Algeria for instructions from the government. The Gestapo took him to Buchenwald concentration camp. To make matters worse, Pierre Brossolette fell into enemy hands at the same time as Ballard. Soon he died trying to escape. He threw himself out of a window in the Gestapo building and crashed. Pierre Brossolette, a valiant fighter by his courage, his fiery will, the prestige he enjoyed among the various elements of the resistance, was also worthy of the post of general delegate, like Jean Moulin. He was not affiliated to any political party and expected effective results both in the days of war and tomorrow. In the days of peace, only from Gaullism elevated to a social, moral and political doctrine. In March 1944, I entrusted the duties of delegate to Alexandre Parodi, a member of the Council of State and Director General of the Ministry of Labour. He, too, had refused to serve under Vichy. His brother, René, was a member of the resistance and one of the first to give his life for France. Misfortune pursued my representatives. Meanwhile, the communists were gradually carrying out their intentions concerning the National Council of the Resistance. They had succeeded in bringing 5 of its 15 members under their control, either explicitly or secretly. The National Council, on its own initiative, decided to elect a chairman, and Georges Bidault became the chairman. He was a prominent member of the resistance, characterized by an extraordinary aptitude for political activity before the war. Bidault was known as a talented journalist and an influential member of the Christian Democrats, who had an ambitious desire to turn this small group into a real big party and to be its head. He willingly accepted the role offered to him, unafraid of the dangers involved. One of them, and by no means the least of them, was the danger of finding himself in this Areopagus under the aegis of a disciplined group, skilled in revolutionary activity, perfectly able both to inflate its importance and to establish comradeship. I was soon already informed of the inroads of this group, of the trouble it was causing Georges Bidault, and of the difficulties it would soon create for me as well. Indeed, the Council of the Resistance informed me that, since its plenary meetings must of necessity be infrequent, it had entrusted its powers to a bureau of 4 members, of whom 2 were communists, while military matters were entrusted to the Action Committee. It had set up, dominated by party members. The development of our movement in France during this period, that is, at the end of 1943 and the beginning of 1944, was of great concern to me, especially as I was in Algeria, and from there my voice could be heard in France worse than from London. The personal contact with the whole French nation, which radio had enabled me to establish, was gradually weakening. The waves of the Algerian stations were less well known in France than those of the BBC. Meanwhile, our broadcasts from Algeria, from Tunisia and from Rabat became interesting and took on a character of their own. This was undoubtedly the merit of Henry Bonnet, Commissioner of Information, Jacques Lesson, Director of Radio France, Jean Amrouche, Henry Benazet, Jean Cast, Georges Gorce, Jean Rouaud and others. It is true that the broadcasts of the large station in Brazzaville, supervised by Géraud Jouve and operating at full capacity, now attracted an increasing number of listeners in all parts of the world. I had the impression, however, that my voice was deafening to the French. It became more difficult for me to speak to the nation. It also became more difficult to maintain secret communications with France. These connections had been organized while I was still in London. Using the methods we had gradually developed, we sent our instructions and proclamations from London. We sent reports to London, sent agents there, those who wished to visit us, and people who had fled from France came to London. We used airplanes, patrol boats, telegraphs, radios, liaisons. In a word, a kind of rhythmic movement was established, controlled from London, and became habitual for the courageous army of our informers, liaisons, expeditionaries. This thread could not be broken. It was not easy to create a new one while in Algeria, for we had not yet found the means to do so, and we were hampered by the distance. For example, a light single-engine airplane, having taken off from the English base, in 2 hours could land in France on some random site and immediately fly back. But in order to connect with our metropolis Algiers, Oran or at least Ajaccio, it was necessary to have a twin-engine airplane, to fly it for a long time, to have for landing a large and flat area, and before the return flight to replenish the fuel supply. Therefore, we still left the main apparatus of our communications in England. This required multiple transfers and crossings, caused delays and all sorts of misunderstandings. The confusion was intensified by the fact that, in addition to the special services of the fighting France, there was also the former intelligence service of the French Army General Staff. Until November 1942, it was located in Vichy, operated under the leadership of Colonels Ronan Rivet, and all possible measures for her to resist the Germans, and when the enemy occupied in the southern zone of France, it moved to North Africa. The civilian and military commander-in-chief turned her into his liaison apparatus with the metropolis. As long as the double-headedness of the Liberation Committee lasted, there were also two centres of information and action, one attached to me and the other serving General Giraud. As soon as the latter dropped out of the government he was entrusted with purely military tasks, it would seem that nothing should have prevented the unification of the special services. But we were able to realize this unification only a few months later. By decree of November 27, 1943, the Liberation Committee finally signed the appointment of Jacques Soustel as Director General of the Special Services, reporting directly to the head of government. This kind of system was not at all intended to remove officers from the former intelligence service. On the contrary, we expected that the abilities of each specialist would now find wide application. The peculiar nature of the war we had to wage required that our system should represent a unified whole, that it should go beyond the old framework, abandon the old recipes, establish a complex network of links with the maquis, with the groups of the frontieres, with the various organizations of the movement, know how to use underground leaflets and newspapers, sabotage in administrative institutions, cover all forms of the resistance, penetrate into all forms of national struggle. Unfortunately, General Giraud stubbornly opposed the decisions taken by the government on these matters. Referring to his rank as Commander-in-Chief, he wished to retain at his full disposal the very intelligence service he had before the decree. He and I talked about it, and I exhausted myself in proving to him that we needed unity, that he, Giraud, would have ample opportunity to use the apparatus. Nothing helped. With all the weight of his authority, General Giraud continued to refuse to exert pressure on the officers of the services concerned, wanting them, in violation of the rules of discipline, to disobey our orders. Of course, he did so for reasons other than the strategic. For whatever rank he may have held, he did not in reality exercise effective command of military operations our allies jealously reserved that for themselves. But for a certain kind of policy he was not averse to being used. In France, in Africa, and among the French dignitaries who emigrated to the United States, some still encouraged his intentions for their own purposes, of course. So did the missions and headquarters of the Allies, deaf to the voice of life and unwilling to part with their yesterday's plans. They did not take away from Giraud cherished hope to play the first role. That is why, despite my warnings, he persisted in his efforts to maintain separate ties with certain groups in the metropolis, and with the help of the Americans, sent there his own agents, who only added to the confusion. The cup finally overflowed. In April 1944, after one incident more serious than the previous ones, I was forced to demand of General Giraud that this game be stopped. He took the position of procrastination and delay, and then the government by special decree relieved him of the purely nominal duties of Commander-in-Chief and appointed him Inspector General of the Army. This appointment put an end to the ambiguous situation which had been created, and, moreover, gave General Giraud an opportunity of really becoming useful. Wishing to assuage his resentment, I wrote him an official letter in which I attested his services on behalf of the government. In another letter, on my own behalf, I implored him to set an example of selflessness, bearing in mind the tragic circumstances of the motherland. At the same time, the National Liberation Committee decided to award him a military medal with a very flattering proclamation of thanks. General Giraud preferred to resign. He did not accept the appointment to the post offered him, refused the military medal, and departed, choosing the vicinity of Mazagan as his residence. "I want to be commander-in-chief or nothing," he said. His departure caused no excitement, either in the troops or among the populace. Incidentally, just at this time, some of his adherents from among the former figures of Vichy were dissatisfied with him for his behavior in the case of Puget. General Giraud was reproached for not standing up for the accused, although he came to North Africa, having received an official guarantee from the civil and military commander-in-chief. As for me, I was deeply distressed at General Giraud's persistent desire to retire, although the war was far from over. But what can our griefs matter when it comes to the order of the state? Especially when France is suffering. After all, we knew what was going on there, for we received reports through couriers in particular, those brought to us from Paris by our subversive service in the administrative offices. We were informed by delegates to the Consultative Assembly and by people who had escaped from France by crossing the Pyrenees. We were also informed by our commissioners who had made their way from Algiers to the metropolis and back Guillain de Benouville, Borges Monori, François Son, Louis Mangin, General Brisac, Colonel Zeller, Gaston Defer, François Mitterrand, my nephew Michel Caillat and others. Never have the material conditions of life been steely hard in France. For almost everyone, the question of food became a daily tragedy. From the fall of 1942 until the spring of 1944, the rations issued on cards did not contain 1,000 calories. Agriculture had no workers, no fuel, no fertilizers, no bandages, and for all these reasons it produced only 2/3 of its pre-war output. Of what was taken by requisition, the occupiers took a considerable part. Meat, for example, they took half of what was left to the owners and could go to the black market for sale to the population. The occupiers also took a part. For all that the Germans devoured in this way, they paid in money, which they drew from the French treasury. In all, they received from there 300 billion until August 1943 and more than 400 billion until March 1944. There were still 1.5 million Frenchmen in enemy prisoner of war camps. It is true that Germany freed and sent back to France 100,000 prisoners of war. But the service of labor conscription was to bring her nothing less than 1 million civilians. Besides, the Reich forced to work for it directly 1/3 of all our factories, burned half of our coal, took away 65% of all our steam locomotives, 50% of our wagons, 60% of our wagons, 60% of our trucks, used our equipment, our materials for the construction of the Atlantic rampart for Germany. With the poverty in which the majority of Frenchmen were living, the questions of food, clothing, fuel, lighting, transportation became for them agonizing, often insoluble. And so the war once again unleashed an avalanche of destruction and death upon the land of France. After the armistice there had been a respite in this respect, as the perpetrators of the surrender boasted, but now there were air raids and bloodshed. In Dieppe, then in Saint Nazaire, British aviation with the help of French air groups led over the heads of the inhabitants of air battles with the enemy, flying in waves and returning to the bases. Bombing of cities became more frequent. They caused great damage to the population, especially Paris, Nantes, Rouen, Lyon, St. Etienne and their environs. It was a prelude to the serious destruction that France was to undergo during the coming great battle. Before the Allied troops landed, 30,000 people had been killed by aerial bombardment. In many places, particularly in the department of Aisne, in the Massif Central, in the Alps, in Limousin, in the Dordogne, the Maquis began armed demonstrations against the occupiers, and those in retaliation responded by shooting the population, fires, arrests of hostages, monetary contributions. The accomplice of the enemy was the Vichy militia, its military field courts without any trial passed death sentences on many patriots. In fact, repression became for the enemy real military operations. He conducted them with terrifying methodology and precision. He wanted to cleanse his rear before the battle, the proximity of which he already felt. That is why the Gestapo and the German gendarmerie, together with the Vichy police and militia, now under the authority of Darnand, the General Secretary for the Maintenance of Order, furiously persecuted our underground groups and the entire movement. They used all kinds of intimidation, torture, and bribery, trying to extract confessions from the unfortunates who fell into their clutches to force them to betray other patriots. Shortly before the landing of the Allied troops, many leaders of the resistance were killed: Cavay, Marshal Médéric Péry, Politzer, Ripochet, Tuny, and others. 20,000 members of the resistance were executed. 50,000 people were deported. At the same time, the shameful horrors of the persecution of the Jews were revealed. And at the same time, the Reich forced the political prisoners arrested by Vichy, notably Heriot, Reynaud, Daladier, Blum, Mandel, Gamelin, Jacquem, to be extradited to it. The Gestapo also arrested other prominent persons, such as Albert Maraud, François Poncet, Colonel de la Roque, major officials, financiers, industrialists, high officers, and sent them to Germany, expecting that they would serve as hostages or someday be used for a prisoner exchange. But despite the repression, the resistance grew wider and wider. Patriot strike groups killed more and more Germans in armed assaults, in battles, in hand-to-hand combat, in railroad disasters when they derailed entire trains carrying German soldiers. Increasingly, patriots punished traitors and informers. The aims of the movement had already been clearly formulated, publicized everywhere, announced in proclamations. This great universal and national movement gave rise to high thoughts and feelings. Moral doctrines were based on it, and art and literature were inspired by it. Thanks to the marvels of patriot ingenuity, underground newspapers were regularly published. Some obtained paper for them, others typed and printed them, others distributed them. The newspapers Front Tire, Combat, Resistance, Défense de la France were issued daily with a total circulation of 600,000 copies. Lettres Françaises, Cahiers de la Libération, Cahiers du Témoignage Chrétien, Université Libre à Libre, and other journals were secretly passed through many doors. The clandestine publishing house Editions de Mignon distributed books. One of them, The Silence of the Sea by Vercors, was reproduced and distributed in innumerable copies. Thanks to the care of the Algerian government, the radio constantly broadcast the speech of those whose instrument of struggle is the pen and thought. On behalf of those who are free and those who are silent, I solemnly expressed my gratitude to them at a large meeting organized by the French Alliance Society on October 30th, and the airwaves carried its echoes to Paris. The flowering of French thought confirmed the correctness of our policy. What could the disguised ambition and low designs of some gentlemen do against this pure spring of courage and renewal? Perhaps our unity, I thought, is a short-lived upsurge, and tomorrow there will come again a stupor and all will wane. But tomorrow is another day. In the meantime, the war is going on. I felt behind me the moral support of the French people. It will help me rally them. All the more so because the national instinct had more definitely than ever chosen me as the center of unity. For it is against me that politicians are maneuvering in search of guarantees for their activities in the near future. For it is to me that people of the so-called leadership class, that is, those who hold high positions, who have wealth and fame, are now drawn. Of this category, one group, the one that thinks least of money, has been following me for a long time, while the others, in a state of mental confusion, are waiting for me to save them from the shocks that are dangerous to them, and now bow respectfully before me, postponing for the time being their criticism and their insults. The mass of the French, who do not think of speculating on the tragedy of the nation, are waiting for my arrival, which will be a liberation for them. And finally, for those who are fighting, I have become like a symbol of what they want to achieve at the cost of their great sacrifices. How can I describe what I felt one evening when Sir Moise Simon, who had just arrived from France, where he died shortly afterward, brought me the last words of the young resistance fighters sentenced to death, the photographs of the walls of the prison cells where, on the last sleepless night, the death row inmates carved my name in stone, their last letters to their families, in which they speak of me as their leader. The accounts of the witnesses who heard the last cries of the fighters led out to be shot. Long live France! Long live de Gaulle! It is they who dictate to me my duty at the very moment when I am most in need of it. For the fatigue and burden of the task at hand had sapped my physical and spiritual strength. At the beginning of 1944, I fell seriously ill. But thanks to the care of doctors Lichtwitz and de Croix safely out of the crisis, although at that time there were already rumours that the general dying. Of course, the 2 years of the struggle of Free France were full of shocks and disappointments. But then we had to put everything on the line. We were surrounded by an atmosphere of heroism, sustained by the need to win at all costs. There was a deep harmony between me and those who came under my leadership, all of them volunteers, and it was a powerful support for me. We were now close to our goal, but it seemed to me that the ground beneath my feet was becoming shaky, and that I was breathing less pure air. Some selfish intentions and rivalries were springing up all around, and human weaknesses were becoming more noticeable every day. At the Villa Wisteria, I lock myself in my office and begin to knead the tough dough of daily work. It is necessary to read the papers, although my closest collaborators Palevsky, Bijot, Sustel on my order to present me only the most important materials. I have to make decisions, even the most fundamental ones. It is necessary to receive people, in spite of the system of restricted admission that I have practiced. I have received national commissioners, foreign diplomats, leaders of the Allied and French military forces, some high officials, envoys coming from or going to France, some distinguished visitors. With very few exceptions, I do not call anyone by telephone, and I myself am never summoned to the apparatus. I deliberately leave it to members of the government to compare different points of view and determine the activities to be undertaken. My nature tells me and experience confirms that at the top of state affairs one can save one's time and energy only by methodical efforts to stay high enough and far enough away. But because of this remoteness, it is especially necessary at certain moments to have a live contact with people and environment. And I tried to establish the best possible contact, to see with my own eyes what was being done in the field. During the 15 months of my stay in Algeria, in addition to the meetings and official ceremonies that took place in our capital, I spent 100 days travelling. In Algiers, I visited towns and villages, inspected troops, ships, squadrons. 4 times I went to Morocco, 3 times to Tunisia. Went to Libya once. Made a great trip through Black Africa, travelling all over its territory. Crossed Corsica 3 times. 3 times was in Italy, on the fronts of action of our armed forces. During the Allied landings in Normandy, went to England, and from there to France, in Bayeux. Some time later, my first visit to the United States and Canada took place. These trips infused me with vigour. How tiresome people are when you see their ambition and intrigue up close, and how good they are at fighting for a great cause. By natural inclination, and by the exigencies of duty, my private life is very simple. I chose the Villa Olivia for my residence, where I settled with my wife, who had come to stay with me, and my daughter Anne, whose health still troubled us, and we were soon joined by a second daughter, Elizabeth, who had returned from Oxford. She had entered the Foreign Press Review Department at Allegra. Philip was still sailing and fighting in the Channel and the Atlantic. In the evening I tried to be alone in my villa, working on the speeches I was constantly having to make, but often we had receptions. Foreigners and Frenchmen visited us, and we enjoyed seeing them at our table, though the menu was very modest, as we all had to live on rations. It happened that we spent Sundays in a small house in Kabylia. Once in a while we received news from our relatives. My brother Xavier managed to find refuge in Nyon, from where he sent us useful information. His daughter Genevieve fell into enemy hands with the other leaders of the Défense de la France group, and was sent to Ravensbrück. His eldest son was fighting in Italy. My sister, Alfred Kayelet's wife, was arrested by the Gestapo, spent a year in Fran prison, and from there was taken to Germany. Her husband, an old man of 67, was sent to Buchenwald. One of their sons, Charles, an officer in the Jaeger regiment, and fell on the battlefield fighting for France. The other 3 sons crossed the sea and joined our armed forces. My brother Jacques' 3 sons did the same. And he himself, an infirm paralytic, was saved from the German police by the Abbé Pierre and his assistants, who carried him in their arms across the Swiss border. My brother Pierre was followed by the Germans. In 1943, he was arrested and sent to the Eisenberg concentration camp. His wife and 5 children, joined by the daughter of a shot resistance fighter, walked across the Pyrenees to Spain and from there made their way to Morocco. In the Vandrou family, my wife's brothers and sister also chose the path of service to the just cause. In France and in Africa, all our relatives and friends risked their lives for it. Among the many examples of courage, the images of my loved ones lift my spirit. I always think of them when my burden becomes too heavy. It is true that some of this burden falls on my ministers. Before, our organization was much smaller and all its leadership was concentrated in my hands, but now that it is growing, it is necessary to resort to the distribution of power. There is, of course, rivalry and centrifugal sentiment among the national commissars. But, on the whole, a fairly disciplined group has gathered around me. Everyone has his share of power and his share of responsibility. Everyone acts in his own way. Henry Kay, who has been entrusted with the chairmanship of the interministerial commissions, has always shown common sense and prudence, a quality both innate and acquired through long experience, and it is not without reason that he was a member of the government 12 times in the Third Republic. René Massigli is a brilliant figure, inventive, skilled in the intricacies of diplomacy. He is working to rebuild our network of international relations, torn apart by events. Pierre Mendes, France, with a bright mind and a strong will, is resolving the seemingly insoluble questions of our finances in Algeria. René Meyer, endowed with multifaceted abilities, knows how to get the transportation railroad lines, highways and North African ports to work to the utmost. André Le Troca, grumpy and magnanimous, has become the first servant of the army he manages. André Philippe is forever having to restrain the flow of his ideas, which spurt from him, and to contain the fits of bad temper of the consultative assembly. It is not easy for Jean Monnet to play on a wide keyboard of decisions and relationships to get our American allies to deliver the aid promised to us in a timely manner. The peace-loving Henry Bonnet is trying to extinguish the strife between groups that are already challenging each other over various technical means of organizing information. François de Menton, Emmanuel D. Estier, René Capitan and Henry Frenet, who are in charge of the departments of justice, interior, public education and prisoners of war, have a great deal to do in preparing the measures which France will have to implement tomorrow. They are all competing with each other in zeal and are filled with innovative aspirations. Fernand Grenier and Françoise Billaud, one sharp, the other flexible, both capable, active, divide their attention between their posts and their party, which watches their actions from without. As for the ministers who have surrounded me since Free France Georges Catroux, who is accustomed to conducting great affairs, Renaud Pleven, André Dathomé, Adrien Tixia, they are my tried and tested associates, and for 4 years now under difficult conditions, without fear of any hardship. They have been carrying on their work with unfailing zeal, in charge of the affairs of the Muslims, of the colonies, of industrial production, and of labor. All the ministers, whatever their backgrounds, their views, their personalities, bravely joined Charles de Gaulle and shared responsibility with him. Their merits are undeniable, especially since our administrative apparatus is made up of disparate parts and pieces, but for all its shortcomings, the people there are also working selflessly to fulfill their duties. And although the forthcoming reconstruction of the country gives rise to an excess of plans and projects for the future, one cannot but pay tribute to their intelligence and ardent zeal in their work. If in the cabinets of the Algerian government, in the consultative assembly, and in our meetings people are proposing all sorts of projects to rebuild France and the world, everyone is doing his or her direct work in good faith and for modest remuneration. Such officials as Hubert Guérin, Chauvel, Alphen Paris, in the Commissariat for Foreign Affairs in the Commissariat of the Interior, Chevrieux in the Commissariat of Finance, Greg, Gwyndy, Leroy Beaulieu could serve as pillars of our institutions and as models for others. In the Commissariat of Colonies, Laurency in the Commissariat of Transportation, Anduze Ferry in the General Treasury, Postal Vinet such chiefs of staff as Lai. In the Commissariat of Military Affairs, Lemonier. In the Commissariat of Maritime Affairs, Busker. In the Commissariat of Aviation. It must be said that in the end all the threads came down to me, and I could not but know how limited our opportunities were. But if in politics one needs a spring that pushes forward, it is precisely the art of making the most of opportunities. The meetings of the National Committee were now held in the Summer Palace. They took place twice a week. With the help of Louis Jacques, I set the agenda. For each question, the committee heard a report from the minister concerned, and then the debate opened. Everyone gave his or her opinion. If necessary, I invited a member of the committee to speak. I usually gave my opinion at the end of the debate. Then, in conclusion, I would formulate a decision and, if necessary, end the debate. The cabinet decision was communicated to the ministerial departments. Often these decisions took the form of ordinances and decrees. They were then drafted by René Cassin and his legal committee, then discussed at a cabinet meeting, and finally published in the Journal Officiel de la République Française, which was published in its traditional form in Algeria. The ordinances of 10th January, 14th March, 21st April and 19th May 1944 were drafted in the above-mentioned manner, dealing with the organization of power and the activities of the authorities during the liberation. Provision was made for the appointment of 17 regional commissioners with extraordinary powers. They were to be located in Lille, Nancy, Strasbourg, Chalon, Dijon, Clermont-Ferrand, Lyon, Marseille, Montpellier, Limoges, Toulouse, Bordeaux, Poitiers, Rennes, Angers, Rouen and Orleans, as well as the prefect of the Seine department. They were ordered to take all necessary measures to ensure the safety of the French and Allied armies, to organize the administration of the territory, to restore republican law, and to meet the needs of the population. In addition, in each ministry the Secretary-General, appointed in advance from among the highest officials, was to ensure the functioning of the services concerned until the arrival of the minister. In the communes, it was ordered to restore the municipal councils in force in 1939, in place of which the Vichy government often appointed delegations at its discretion. And in order to ensure that the resistance had a proper role in restoring order, that it could express its will normally, and even prevent inevitable excesses, it was envisaged that a liberation committee would be set up in each department. This committee, composed of delegates of the local organizations and parties represented in the National Council of the Resistance, was to give its opinion in administrative matters to the prefect, as the General Council had done before, and to replace the latter until it was restored by election. Finally, the National Commissioner for the Liberated Territories was to take on the spot the urgent measures that would prove necessary. In April, these functions were entrusted to André Latruca. As for the commissioners of the Republic and prefects for the period of liberation, lists of them were prepared by Alexandre Parodi, with the assistance of Michel Debret, and submitted to the government for approval. The appointments were made in secret, each one receiving in his hand the original text of the decree conferring his powers, and having to keep ready to appear on the spot, as if from the smoke of battle. Two of them, Verdier and Fourcade, fell in battle too, Bouy and Cassou, were severely wounded. 9 prefects died for France. But among the French, in the face of our allies in the midst of the war, a coherent, responsible, independent state power had to emerge. At the same time, justice had to be revived. After so much anguish in the country, liberation would undoubtedly unleash a spontaneous thirst for vengeance. After all, tens of thousands of patriots, men and women, were shot. Hundreds of thousands were taken away to horrible extermination camps, from which only a few will return. Thousands of activists of underground resistance organizations, partisans, fighters of strike groups were outlawed by the enemy, and, if captured, destroyed on the spot, because the occupiers committed innumerable murders, arson, robberies, atrocities of all kinds, subjected people to cruel torture, and all this was done with the complicity of traitors, with the direct assistance of ministers, officials, French police, militia and spies for years in newspapers, magazines, plays, and public speeches. The minions of the enemy spewed insults against those who fought for France, and praised the occupiers for in governmental, administrative, financial, industrial, secular circles. So many scoundrels mocked the humiliation and misery of the nation and flaunted their collaboration with the invaders. What wonder if the flight of the German hordes should prove to be the signal for a swift and bloody reprisal against the traitors? Undoubtedly it would. And yet no private individual has the right to punish criminals. This is the business of the state. And it is necessary that the state, in the exercise of this duty, should administer swift and righteous judgment, promptly carry out investigations and pass sentences. Otherwise a wave of rage will sweep over everything, which will engulf groups of people or individuals. And so the Liberation Committee, by its Ordinance of June 26, 1944, supplemented by the Ordinance of August 26, defined the conditions under which the crimes and misdemeanors of the collaborators were to be punished. The legal basis for the charge existed in our code, the article on aiding and abetting the enemy. But this time the circumstances were exceptional, and in some cases even mitigating because of the position taken by the Vichy government which gave its orders. In view of this unprecedented political situation, and in order to enable the judges to avoid at all costs the usual sanctions for offences that were not in fact crimes, a new type of punishment was introduced, namely disqualification. It entailed deprivation of political rights, prohibition to hold public office and, as a maximum penalty, expulsion. Thus, knowing what kind of misdemeanors and crimes were punishable, and having a rather flexible scale of punishments, the tribunals would make their decisions. What kind of tribunals? It goes without saying that our ordinary criminal and correctional courts cannot deal with such cases. By their very nature, they are not fit for that purpose. Nor are they suitable for it by their very composition, for many of the judges were forced to swear allegiance to Pétain and passed sentences in accordance with Vichy's orders. Something new was needed. And the Liberation Committee had already ordered in advance the creation of special judicial chambers in the courts of second instance. The appointment of the president of the trial chamber and of the prosecutor was to be made by the Ministry of Justice. 4 jurors were to be chosen by lot from a list drawn up by the president of the second instance court, with the assistance of 2 representatives of the resistance appointed by the Commissioner of the Republic, who was obliged in all cases to include members of the resistance in the activities of official bodies. As for those who had been members of the Vichy government, or who held the principal posts, those responsible for the surrender or guilty of collaboration, their crimes must be tried before the Supreme Court. However, the fate of one of them had been decided in Algeria. This is Pierre Pichet. He was Minister of the Interior in the Vichy government and persecuted the resistance with such severity that he became the chief punisher. Having parted with his ministry in 1942, Pichet went to Spain. At his request, General Giraud, who was then civil and military commander-in-chief, allowed him to come to Morocco and join the army, provided that all this happens in secret. But as the former minister was defiantly showing himself everywhere, Giraud ordered him to be kept under house arrest. Later, when the Liberation Committee decided to put members of the Vichy government on trial, Pierre Pichet was imprisoned. The question then arose, should he be tried immediately? The government unanimously decided to start the trial. As a matter of principle, there was no reason to postpone it. Moreover, it was necessary for the good of the state to set an example of justice as soon as possible. The moment had come when the resistance forces were to become an essential element of national defense. Just at this time, the naval government, of which Darnand was a member as a person authorized to maintain order, was trying its best, together with the Germans, to destroy all order in the country. It was necessary that both our fighters and their opponents should be shown without delay that criminals must be held accountable for their actions. I stated this from the rostrum of the Consultative Assembly and quoted the words of Clemenceau: war. All for war. Judgment. Let the country know that it will be defended. Unable to convene a Supreme Court, the Liberation Committee entrusted the trial of Pouchet to the Tribunal of the Army. The president of the tribunal was Verin, the first president of the Algerian Court of Second Instance, and the judges were Councillor Fischer and Generals Chadebek de Lavalade, Cochet and Schmidt. The duties of the prosecutor were performed by General Weiss. The accused defended himself with skill and vigour, but among the other acts charged against him there were 2 offences which compelled the tribunal to sentence the culprit to capital punishment. As minister, Pouchet had sent out a circular order to the prefects to provide the Reich, by way of labour conscription, with the number of workers he demanded. Moreover, there was every reason to believe that when, at Chateaubriand, the Germans decided to execute some prisoners in reprisal for the murder of their soldiers, the wretch Pouchet, of his own accord, sent them a list of the persons whom he requested to be executed first. The enemy complied with his vile request. After the liberation, formal proofs of the crime were found. General Giraud, summoned to court as a witness, spoke very discreetly of the accused. After the verdict, he came to me and asked for a stay of execution. I, of course, could only reply with a refusal. Pierre Pouchet himself maintained to the end that he had acted only in the interests of the state. In his last word at the trial, he exclaimed, alluding to de Gaulle, "Let him on whom France now places all its hopes take my life, if it will help him to fulfill his mission." I will give him my life. He met death courageously. Himself commanded PI to the soldiers assigned to shoot. In the hurricane of disasters that shook the motherland, people, divided into 2 camps, wanted to lead the nation and the state to goals sharply different and in ways directly opposite. From that moment on, it was established that the responsibility of both was determined here on earth, not by their intentions, but by their actions, but since it was a matter of saving the homeland. No matter what people's thoughts may be, everyone will be rewarded according to his deeds. And then? And then? May the Lord God judge the souls of the dead. Let France bury their bodies. But the country, it must live. The Liberation Committee tried to make sure that it could live when the shackles were thrown off. I was personally convinced that of the whole ocean of financial, economic, social problems which would then immediately confront her, only that which would be worked out, prepared and solved in advance would be practically possible, and therefore I concentrated a large part of the government's efforts on the future object of its activity. I knew that 3 mortal dangers awaited us: inflation, intolerably low wages and service charges, and food shortages. Indeed, because of the contributions paid to the occupiers for their maintenance, the amount of paper money in circulation by the spring of 1944 was 3 times the amount circulating in 1940, and the quantity of goods had halved. This caused a huge increase in real prices, frenzied speculation on the black market, and untold hardship for the majority of the population. At the same time, under pressure from the enemy, who wanted to get French workers for Germany, wages in factories and plants and salaries of employees were blocked on the basis of very low tariffs. On the other hand, some merchants, businessmen and middlemen made fabulous profits. Given the psychological upheaval that liberation would cause, it was to be expected that the country would immediately face a catastrophic depreciation of money, a wave of social demands and famine. The government had no right to let things go on as they were that would condemn the country to irreparable upheavals, for under the blow of liberation inflation would break out, and then all the dams would collapse. And to attempt to block deposits, banknotes, wages and prices at the same time would have caused the cauldron to explode. Such an endeavour would require heavy coercive measures that could hardly be borne by a nation that had just emerged from oppression. It would cause social upheaval incompatible with the need to revive production and raise the country from its ruins. The markets would then empty. And meanwhile, the public authorities would have no other means of feeding the people, since all stocks were gone and the public treasury had no currency for massive purchases of food abroad, and the Allied merchant fleet would then still be busy transporting war cargoes. Between the 2 extremes, the Liberation Committee made a middle solution, which, however, was not easy either. to exchange bank bills, to tax those who had become rich during the war, to confiscate illegal profits, to regulate bank current accounts, leaving at the disposal of depositors only the sums necessary for their immediate needs, and appealing to the optimism that victory over the enemy would engender in the country, to issue a domestic loan for a large sum it would absorb a large part of the available liquid sums, and thus reduce the amount of paper money in circulation. Equalize the purchase prices of essential agricultural products by means of subsidies to commodity producers, and thus keep the selling prices low. The subsidies will cause an influx of products into the markets. We must increase the wages of workers and the salaries of employees. A substantial increase, 30% in this way, we will avoid a social crisis. But in addition, it is already necessary to provide reinforcements in the form of food imports from outside. To this end, in the spring of 1944, the government built up a food reserve of $10 billion in the overseas territories and worked out with Washington a 6-month plan for initial American aid. By such measures, we could have averted the worst, but even after liberation, the nation would still have to endure hardship and live on rations for a long time to come. No magic incantation, no amount of business acumen will instantly turn poverty into wealth. With all the marvels of ingenuity and organization, it will still take much time, order, labor, and sacrifice to rebuild what has been destroyed and to renew the broken or worn-out equipment of industrial plants. Yes, and for all these efforts, it is still necessary to obtain the cooperation of the working classes, otherwise everything will collapse into an abyss of disorder and demagogy. It is necessary to nationalize the main sources of energy: coal, electricity, gas, which, by the way, only the state can exploit properly. It is necessary to give the nation the right to control credit, so that it does not depend on financial monopolies for its actions. It is necessary to pave the way to association for the working class through factory committees, to free the men and women of our country from the agonizing fear for their lives and their work by establishing compulsory social insurance for sickness, unemployment, and old age. Finally, it is necessary to establish a social security system for the working class. This is the reform program which I proclaimed on March 15, 1944, and which my government has actually carried out. In this part of our policy, we could count on the support of public opinion. After all, in times of calamity, the people's desire for progress always increases. Many people had the feeling that the trials which the war had brought upon us must bring about a wide change in the conditions of human existence. If nothing is done in this regard, there will be an inevitable slide of the masses towards communist totalitarianism. Conversely, by acting without delay, the soul of France can be saved. In addition, the privileged would not dare to oppose the strong opposition, so compromised is this social stratum by Vichy's mistakes, and so terrified is it by the spectre of revolution. As for the members of the resistance, they are always on the side of evolution. Fighters who have been exposed to the same danger together feel like brothers. For the same reasons that demand speedy reforms in the metropolis, changes in the statutes of the overseas territories, and the granting of rights to their populations are also necessary. I have been more convinced of this than anyone since I began to wage war with the men and resources of the French Empire. May it be doubted that immediately after the fires of war that have engulfed the world have died down, a deep wave will rise in the human ocean, a thirst for liberation. What is already happening or is about to happen in Asia, in Africa, in Australia, will echo everywhere. For if the disasters that befell us did not destroy the loyalty of the peoples of our overseas territories, they did witness events that severely undermined our prestige: the catastrophe of 1940, the humiliation of Vichy, which fell under the heel of the enemy, the arrival of the Americans as hosts after the absurd fighting in November 1942. It is true that throughout French Africa, the indigenous population was ready to follow the example of France in battle and, seeing in their native land the beginning of a revival of French life, wanted wholeheartedly to participate in it. This is where the renewal can begin, but on the obligatory condition that these states and these territories should not be kept in the position in which they once were. Since it is not good to delay in a good cause, I decided that my government should take the initiative here. In December 1943, I supported General Katra, the National Commissioner for Muslim Affairs, when he submitted to the Liberation Committee a draft of an important reform for Algeria. Until then, the Algerian population had been divided into two electoral curiae. The first consisted of Frenchmen, either by descent or naturalization compared with the second curia, which embraced the whole mass of Muslims. The first had an overwhelming majority in municipal and general councils. It alone was represented in the French Parliament. We issued a decree according to which tens of thousands of capable Muslims were to be assigned to the first curia, regardless of their personal status. All others were entitled to vote in the second curia. Finally, the proportion of deputies elected by the second curia to representative assemblies, including the French chambers, was increased to parity with the first curia. This was a significant step towards equality in political and civil rights for the entire population of Algeria. Of course, the reform drew muted criticism from both colonists and some Muslim circles, but many Arabs and Kabylians seemed to be elated with hope and gratitude to France, which, without waiting for the end of its troubles, decided to improve their fate and link it with its own. At the same time, people in all quarters were struck by the determination and speed with which the government had taken these measures, whereas the previous regime had been blocking their way for so many years. On December 12, 1943, I went to Constantine, accompanied by General Catrou and several ministers. In Constantine, in the Place de la Bresse, in the presence of countless inhabitants, I promulgated our decisions. I saw Dr. Benjelloul and many Muslims who were near the tribune weeping with excitement. To approve the new course of policy which should lead to the French Union, we took advantage of another occasion, the African Conference at Brazzaville. It was proposed and organized by René Pleven, the National Commissioner for the Colonies. At his call, 20 governors-general and governors were to assemble. Félix Ibouy was foremost among them. The conference was attended by the President of the Consultative Assembly and 10 of its delegates, as well as by distinguished persons of no official position. The purpose of the conference was to exchange views and experiences, and to establish on what concrete basis a French community covering all the territories of Black Africa could be gradually established to replace the existing system of direct administration. I set out for Brazzaville with deliberate solemnity. After passing through Morocco, I arrived in Dakar, where the authorities, the army, the navy, the colonists, and the indigenous population greeted me with indescribable delight. It was in Dakar that access to Senegal had been blocked by cannon fire 3 years earlier. I visited Conakry, Abidjan, Lome, Cotonou, Douala, and Libreville, and in all these towns my arrival was met with great expressions of joy and confidence in victory. At Brazzaville, I received a most cordial welcome, the town feeling proud of having served as a refuge for sovereign France in the most trying years. I stayed at the Maison de Gaulle. As a token of its generous affection, the city had built me this dwelling in a magnificent setting on the banks of the Congo. On January 30th, I opened the conference. After the speech in which Pleven welcomed me, I explained in my address why the government had decided to call this conference, without wishing to exaggerate. I said, "The urgency of the motives which compel us to hasten the study of the complex of problems connected with the French territories in Africa, we believe that the events now shaking the whole world oblige us to hasten." Praising France's civilizing efforts in Black Africa, I noted that even before the war, the need to develop its productive forces on new bases on the basis of the wide acquaintance of its population with progress and French sovereignty had become clear. How urgent is this now, when the war, which was, and will be largely an African war, has raised the question of the conditions of human existence, and has everywhere caused a strain on the human soul. Now notion can live only for the present day, it looks to the future. It wonders about its destiny. And so France, I declared, had decided to lead to the new times 60 million men in alliance with 42 million of her sons and daughters. Why? First of all, because she is France. Then because in her overseas lands and in their loyalty she has found support and a springboard for her liberation. And finally, because she is now inspired by a fervent desire for renewal. The conference then went to work. The proposals it prepared dealt mainly with administrative, social and cultural matters. The Assembly of Governors, of course, could not resolve the constitutional questions connected with the transformation of the empire into a French union. But the path had already been set, and the only thing left to do was to follow it. A spirit has been instilled which, if only we want it, will turn the urgent reform into a national cause of world importance. And no one in the world doubted it. Suddenly Brazzaville had the attention of the world. What was happening was solely the goodwill of France, for the moment had come when she felt that her power was reviving, her faith in herself reviving, and she herself had decided to grant what no one had ever tried to wrest from her. After shaking hands with Ibui, whom I never saw again, I took an airplane to return. After parting with the capital of Equatorial Africa, we flew through Bangui, Fort Lamy, Zinder, Niamey, Gao and returned to Algiers, where the tricolour flag was flying over the roof of my residence. No one could any longer doubt that it was the symbol of legitimate authority. But what we had achieved, in fact, had to be expressed in legal terms. It was time for the government to adopt a name befitting it. In spite of the appalling division, I cherished to the last possible moment the hope that this proclamation might take place in an atmosphere of national unity, and that the regrouping of forces in the state would take place before events themselves settled the dispute once and for all. For 4 whole years I have left it to those people who, taking advantage of the nation's misfortunes, fancied themselves vested with supreme power to say one day we have made a mistake. Here we are before you with the semblance of rights which the purely external forms of legality give us, and those men who have done nothing unworthy and have followed us so far, obeying the requirements of discipline and fidelity to their oaths, want to be in your ranks with us. The enemy may make us pay dearly for this step, but still we give orders to fight him, to destroy him by all means and everywhere he is. And then, if necessary, let politicians, justice and history pass judgment on us. But now let us stand beside you in the last, decisive battle for the unity and salvation of France. Alas! This cry did not ring out. As the saying goes, not everyone confesses who has repented, but from one day to the next we were waiting for the armies of liberation to set foot on the soil of our homeland. For France, and for the whole world, it has become an urgent necessity that our power, as it has developed, should assert, even in its very name, the rights with which it has been endowed by the election of the people. On the 7th of May, I announced in Tunis to those who believe that, after liberation, France may return to the days of feudalism and be divided among several governments. We appoint a date at the earliest possible moment in Marseilles, on the expanse of the Cannebières, in Lyons, on the place Belcourt, in Lille, on the place Maine, in Bordeaux, on the Seine, in Strasbourg, on the boulevard Broglie, and in Paris, somewhere between the Arc de Triomphe and the Cathedral of Our Lady of Paris. On the 15th of May, I heard in the Consultative Assembly the unanimous decision it had taken on the proposal of Albert Geisier. This decision was formalized by an ordinance of June 3, 1944. The moment I left by plane for England, from where the liberation offensive began 3 days later, the National Liberation Committee became the provisional government of the French Republic. Diplomacy, for all the conventionality of its forms, recognizes only real facts. While we were deprived of everything, we could be pitied but little helped. And now the unity of the French forces was revived. This was something weighty to be reckoned with. Gradually, France reappeared on the world stage. The French no longer doubted that their country would be saved, and the Allies recognized it as indisputable that someday it would be necessary to return France to its former place. And foreseeing this circumstance, they paid much attention to us in their policy. Moreover, our assistance was becoming more and more tangible to them every day. First of all, without our troops, the battle for Tunisia would have ended in defeat. And soon the military operations of the French in a key sector of Italy led to victory. As for the coming struggle in France, governments and military staffs took into account that it would involve our internal forces, the army coming from the Empire, and the remnants of our navy. And how valuable to the Allies were our air bases located in Africa and Corsica, what effective assistance they provided them. And the fact that we are fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Allies in itself had a great moral value, was a winning circumstance for them. That is why France, her interests, her feelings were now playing an increasingly important role in the discussion of the issues that arose. And yet, although Washington, London, and Moscow thought of us, they limited their official relations with us to the essentials. The United States, fearing that confusion would break out in Europe, intended to settle the question of peace in the future by direct agreement with Soviet Russia, and had no intention at all of admitting France into the close circle of the leading powers. Already the presence of England in this circle often seemed to them inappropriate, despite the fact that London tried in every possible way not to contradict America in anything. And how France, with her principles and her ruins, would be in the way. Yes, besides, she would be the mouthpiece of the middle and small nations. How, then, would it be possible to obtain from the Soviets the cooperation that the White House dreamed of, and for the sake of which it would inevitably be necessary to sacrifice the independence of the Pribylonian, Danubian, and Balkan states? With regard to Asia and its markets, the American plan was to put an end to the empires of the European states there. With regard to India, the question had apparently already been settled. In Indonesia, Holland could hardly last long. But what about Indochina if France revived and regained her place among the great powers? So, willingly recognizing our revival, agreeing with us when it was useful for the cause, Washington tried as long as possible to consider France as a field left fallow, and to look at the de Gaulle government as an accidental phenomenon, inconvenient and generally not worth being treated as a real state power. England did not allow herself such a simplistic assessment of the situation. She knew that the presence, strength, and influence of France would be as necessary to the European balance tomorrow as it had been yesterday. She could in no way reconcile herself to the abdication of France that the Vichy regime was, which had also done her much harm. Both by instinct and politics, she wanted France to be her partner again, as compliant and familiar as before. But why hasten events? Victory was now certain, and it had already been decided that the French forces would assist the Allies to the utmost. As for the settlement of a number of issues in the future, perhaps let France take part in it, but only on the condition that it agrees to act as an auxiliary value and submit to the political game of the United States, which England fully supports. But whether General de Gaulle will show the proper pliability, that is more than doubtful. In short, all things considered, it will be more advantageous if the sovereignty of France remains for the time being somewhat vague. Especially since, taking advantage of this vagueness, it is possible to do away with the remnants of French competition in the East. Soviet Russia was watching, calculating, and wary. Of course, everything inclined the Kremlin to desire a revitalized France capable of helping it contain the German element and remain independent of the United States. But there was no hurry. Now it is necessary to win, to make sure that the second front opened from the English Channel to the Adriatic, and not to take a political position too different from that of the Anglo-Saxons. Besides, if the France of General de Gaulle takes a direct part in the settlement of European affairs, will she agree to the disappearance of the independence of Poland, Hungary, the Balkan states, and who knows, maybe the independence of Austria and Czechoslovakia? And finally, what will France be like tomorrow? On her internal situation, her foreign policy, particularly with regard to the Soviets, will depend to a great extent. Who can guarantee that this policy will not be hostile under the influence of the very elements which created Vichy? Conversely, is it impossible that the communists will come to power in Paris? In either case, it would be better not to make any great advances to the Algerian government now. In short, in expressing courtesy and sympathy to us, Russia essentially felt that we should wait and see. In general, if the diplomats of Washington, London, and Moscow harbored far from identical backward thoughts, they were agreed that we should be given our former place in the circle of powers, but that we should not be in a hurry to regain it. With regard to de Gaulle, we should consider that he has become the leader and symbol of France's revival. However, it is necessary to reduce his scope a little. It is quite essential. The very fact that de Gaulle went on the way to unite the French people, who were so divided that he managed to create a solid and united power, seemed to foreign experts abnormal and even scandalous. Let France climb out of the abyss under its influence. But why should she climb to the top? So officially, de Gaulle was treated with respect, but without much willingness to help him. But unofficially, they encouraged everything that was said, written, plotted against de Gaulle's intentions. And later they began to do everything to make France to lead its former policy, familiar to all, easily amenable to external pressures. I must say, however, that the continuing uncertainty in the diplomatic situation of the Algerian government did not bother me much. I felt that the most important thing had already been done and that, if we continued to be as persistent as before, the formal recognition that we still had to achieve would sooner or later come, so to speak, by itself. And it is not fitting that our position now and in the future should depend on the will of others. We are already sufficiently established now to force ourselves to listen when we need to. The future of France is in her own hands, not in the hands of the Allies. As soon as the Reich is defeated, the major nations will deal with the difficulties we face, and nothing will prevent France from playing the role she wants if only she wants to. I was so sure of this that I looked indifferently at the frowns of the Allies. I made no secret of the fact that, from the point of view of our common cause, I regretted some restraint in their cooperation with us, but I never got into the posture of a petitioner. Certainly much less restraint was shown by my staff in Algiers, Massigli, who was constantly in contact with the diplomatic corps, and who, by the nature of his profession, suffered from the lack of certainty of our external position in London, Vienot, who had all his life been a preacher of the Franco-English alliance, and was now saddened to see England's evasiveness in Washington, Monnet, who was unable to conclude the negotiations on relief and reconstruction. Because the question of Franco-American relations hung in the air, or Oppenot, who both in mind and heart was painfully aware of the negative attitude of the United States toward us in Moscow, Garaud, who compared the statements of the People's Commissars favorable to France with their cautious actions. I allowed them to show their irritation on occasion. I sympathized with the impatience felt by our delegates to the other allies Dijon, delegate to the governments which had taken refuge in England, Balin, who carried out relations with the Greek and Yugoslav governments at Cairo, Quaford, envoy at Chongqing, Bono, our representative at Ottawa, Peshkov, and then Grandin de la Purview, our representatives in Pretoria, Clarec and his successor, Montmillou in Canberra, Garaud, Dombal, Ledox, Lenchel, Arvinga, Roux, Castren, Lesne, in Latin America, Grus in Havana, Milon de Pelon, in Port-au-Prince. I understood how difficult was the situation of our delegates in neutral countries, Trul, in Spain, Duchail, in Portugal, Saint, Arduin, in Turkey, Benoit, in Egypt, de Vaux Saint Cyr, in Sweden, Lasse, in Switzerland, Lafourcade, in Ireland. I myself, however, deliberately took the position of a head of state who is ready to negotiate with others if they offer it to him, but who does not want to ask for anything today, for he is sure that tomorrow he will get everything without any request. These were the conditions of the game. They are clearly seen in the Italian question as a result of the compromise. The Allies kept us out of the negotiations, but still did not want to exclude us altogether. September 27, 1943, representatives of England and the United States brought Massigli the full text of the armistice agreement, which on the same day was to be handed over for signature to Marshal Badoglio. The Anglo-Saxon diplomats pointed out, and rightly, so that the text of the agreement took into account the wishes we had previously expressed. But they could answer nothing to the French minister's question, "Why did you not involve France?" A few days later, Badoglio declared war on the Reich, in agreement with Great Britain, America and Russia, without our approval. At the same time, we learned that a conference was about to open in Moscow to discuss the Italian problem, a conference of foreign ministers, British, American and Russian, and that we were not invited. When Cordell Hall, on his way to this conference, passed through Algiers, I, in conversation with him, did not allow myself to express the slightest dissatisfaction, but said that we would not give assistance, either in our own name or in our own strength, for nothing. "We are very glad for you," I remarked, "that you will, in the interest of your country, establish direct contact with the Soviets. I, for my part, also envisage going to Moscow someday in the interests of France." When asked by the Secretary of State what our position was in Italian affairs, I replied, "I shall not fail to state our views with all accuracy when I have had an opportunity to familiarize myself with the views of other nations." Cordell Hall then informed me that it would probably be decided in Moscow to set up an inter-union commission on Italian affairs. "It may be," he added, "that you will be a member of it. We shall see," I remarked. At any rate, in order to decide the fate of the Italian state, we must first of all wrest its territory from the Germans, and this will require the assistance of the French armed forces and French bases. I know that Eisenhower expects to ask us for this assistance. We are prepared to give it. But for this, of course, it is necessary that we decide together with you and on equal terms with you how to deal with Italy. We will agree to put our soldiers into battle only for the purpose to which we are agreed. Cordell Hall realized that I was taking a perfectly firm stand. Eden, whom I saw on October 10th, also understood it. As for Bogomolov, he was ahead of me. He himself said that the Mediterranean Commission was being set up at the Soviet proposal and that his government would demand that we be included in the commission. Indeed, on November 16th, Massigli received Macmillan, Murphy, and Bogomolov. They informed him that their governments had the intention of establishing an advisory council on Italian affairs. This board is to represent on the spot the interests of all the Allies, to propose measures to the governments for their joint implementation, and to give instructions on behalf of the Allies to the military commanders in all matters of policy and administration. We are asked to be a member of this board. The Liberation Committee replied with assent. On November 29th, I received Wyszynski, who assured me that his government wished to establish close cooperation with us within the framework of this organization. It then began its work. It consisted of Macmillan, Massigli, Murphy, and Wyszynski. The Liberation Committee soon appointed Cove de Mourville in place of Massigli, who was absorbed in the affairs of his ministry. In this way, we could now keep abreast of events in the Apennine Peninsula. We could also take part in the formulation of measures, of which some were intended to punish Italy for her guilt, and others to enable her to overcome the calamities that had befallen her. In this way, we would be in a position to pursue a policy of our own, very important both for the destinies of Italy and for those of France and the whole of the West. The nature of this policy I outlined to Count Sforza, who came one evening to my study at the Villa Olivia. This old statesman was returning to his native land after 20 years' exile. In the ruins of the fascist regime against which he had fought tirelessly, he was going to direct the foreign policy of his long-suffering homeland. I was struck by Sforza's noble and courageous outlook on the task ahead. "You see me now at your place," he said. "It is a proof of my desire to do my utmost to establish Franco-Italian cooperation, for you and I have paid dearly for its absence in the past, and Europe will need it more than ever." I pointed out to Count Sforza that in this most important matter he and I were of one mind, but that after all that had happened it was impossible for the French to be reconciled to Italy without any compensation on her part, although we were very desirous of treating her with great care. To abolish the privileges enjoyed in Tunis by Italian subjects to return to France the cantons of Tenda and Brigue, which, after the plebiscite of 1860, have gone to Italy, although they are French lands, to straighten the frontier in the gorges of the Larche, at Mont Geneva and Mont Cenis, and at Petit St. Bernard, so that there may be no unfortunate seizure of our slope of the ridge to grant Val d'Aosta the right to be what it actually is, that is, a district purely French in spirit, to demand certain reparations, particularly in the form of military and merchant vessels. These are all the advantages, very limited, but quite certain, which I have determined to obtain for France. On the other hand, in view of the fact that Yugoslavia had passed into the camp of the Allies, and that the troops of General Mihailovich and Tito were now fighting tirelessly on their side, it was clear that Italy could not retain on the eastern shore of the Adriatic Sea her pre-war possessions. We were prepared, however, to help her to retain Trieste for herself. Having stated to Count Sforza my opinion on all points concerning the Italian frontiers, I added as to your colonies, if Cyrenaica, where the English wish to establish themselves, is lost to you, and we ourselves intend to remain in Fezzan, we wish you to remain not only Tonia and Somalia, but also in Eritrea and Tripolitania. In regard to the latter, you will certainly have to find a way of attracting the local nationalities, and in Somalia, in return for the rights which will be granted you, you will have to recognize the supreme authority of the Negus, but we think it just that you should have African territories. If you demand it, we will support you vigorously.